All right, so I'll stop blabbing. So now we're going to go to Hector.
Dr. Hector Zenil has held multiple academic positions, including Oxford, Cambridge, and King's College London. He is also the founder and chief visionary officer of Immune Algorithmics, an AI diagnostic spin-out from these institutions. He previously led a research laboratory at the Karolinska Institute, home of the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, and served as a senior scientific advisor in artificial intelligence at the Alan Turing Institute. His work spans contributions to the original Wolfram Alpha team, collaborations with NASA on microgravity research, and editorial roles in journals such as Frontiers in AI and Theoretical Computer Science. He is the editor-in-chief of the first journal in the field of complex systems, founded by Stephen Wolfram, and the originator of Algorithmic Information Dynamics, a framework for studying causality in dynamical systems that combines algorithmic information theory, perturbation analysis, and statistical causal inference.
Everybody say hi to Hector.
Thank you, Martin. Thanks, Martin, for that kind introduction. Yeah, by the end, I'm hoping to talk a little bit about algorithmic information dynamics. And that's precisely one of the misconceptions I want to tackle, precisely the applications of model of complexity. And first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming and for the invitation to Olaf, Alisa, and the great teams that have organized this wonderful conference. And I'm so glad to see so many familiar faces, old friends, new friends, and colleagues. So let me show you a couple of pictures that I took in the north of Scotland and the north of North Island. On your right is what is called a fairy ring. I don't know if you've seen this before. I was surprised about it because I hadn't seen any before. I didn't even know what was it. I was completely surprised walking around and finding almost like a perfect circle on the floor. Well, it turns out that these are mushrooms that start growing from the center, and they exhaust the resources and start growing towards the periphery, and they build these kind of circles. And this one is not even a nice one, because if you Google it, you are going to find some much better ones. And then on your left, what you have is basal columns that are very common in some places. These ones are from the Giant Causeway in the north of Ireland. I know there's in Mexico, there's in Iceland, there's in a few other places. And these are basically generated by hot lava getting into contact with cold source of water. It can be the sea, a river, or a waterfall. And for me, these two images basically illustrate what we aim in science. So we are the observer, we are looking at some patterns in the world and trying to make sense of it. And basically try to explain what is the mechanistic cause behind them. And in these two cases, these are two completely different causes that I just explained you. One has to do with living systems, and the other one is completely a physical process. Yet both of them are producing patterns. And our purpose as researchers in complexity science or artificial life is usually to try to understand, make sense, and find the mechanistic cause for all this. So I think there's a lot of overlapping between these three areas, especially the complexity community and artificial life, because I think we have come with methods and metrics to try to understand these patterns. And also some overlapping with computability in the sense of, for example, things like open-endedness or self-organization, all these concepts that are related to computation. And let me share with you where I think complexity comes from, because you know the typical explanation for complexity is that we have a lot of particles interacting with each other and suddenly things emerge, complexity emerges. But I actually think that it comes from computation, because you can see in Rule 110 that most of you may be familiar with because it is very popular in the artificial life community. And this is an elementary cellular automaton introduced by Stephen Wolfram, and basically it's a visual computer program that runs from top to bottom from an initial condition and has been proven to be Turing universal. And it illustrates with how little you can reach Turing universality. With just a few bits, basically you start running this and you get Turing universality. And that basically means that you also get unbounded complexity, because Turing universality basically means that you can run any other computable function. It doesn't matter how complex it may look like. And you can see also, this is a nice, very beautiful paper that we wrote some years ago. We were trying to look for what we called prime rules. So what is the minimum set, for example, in elementary cellular automata, that when you combine them, gives you the full space? And turns out that it is very rich, and with only 2-3 rules composing them, you can get any other rule in the same space. But even more surprising was this result. This is another paper where we basically show that you can basically break these barriers between Wolfram's classes. So you remember Stephen Wolfram came with these 4 behavioral qualitative classes, in which he categorized different cellular automata behavior by how the outcome or the output looks like in 4 classes. And what we did was to explore what we call the space of possible compilers. So this space is another space of computer programs. They are fixed size. And actually, it's the way you prove Turing universality. If you want to prove that a system is Turing universal, what you do is to basically design some sort of translator that can be also called a compiler, to show that anything that a Turing universal system computes, you can also compute it, and the other way around. Well, the other way around is trivial. But it turns out that we found that for pretty much every cellular automaton, we could find a compiler that basically sits at the top of the original computer program. It is of fixed size. It is not really carrying out the computation. It's only just translating the input into something else. You can basically emulate any other possible cellular automaton, no matter in which class it may be. And you can see that we didn't complete the picture for elementary cellular automaton. So at the top row, you are seeing which ECA is emulating what, which is the second row. And you can see, for example, that we have class 2 cellular automaton, like rule 94, emulating rule 90 with a compiler. So that's kind of surprising, because basically it's telling that there's nothing fundamentally different between these classes. Any of these computer programs can really behave like any other. There's some trade-offs, by the way, because it is not the same to try to find a compiler for one class 1 than for class 2. So I'm not saying that we are breaking all the barriers, but in some ontological fashion we are. So it is more epistemological, because you have to find these compilers. But immediately when you go to general cellular automata, which is basically expanding the neighborhood of the local rule, you start seeing this more and more. And by the way, it doesn't mean that we couldn't find a compiler that makes a class 1 emulate a class 3 or 4. It only means that we didn't go far enough in the space of compilers to find the compiler to emulate it. It was slightly easier when going to the larger general cellular automata space. And you can see that we found actually very simple computer programs that are able to emulate very complex ones with the appropriate compiler. In other words, this is kind of a very strong empirical evidence of pervasive Turing universality. Basically, any of these very simple computer programs are able of Turing universality, because each of them can emulate every other cellular automaton in the same space. And that actually has a name. It is called intrinsic universality, and has been proven to be a stronger kind of universality than Turing universality. In other words, it implies Turing universality. So I think this is a very fundamental paper that potentially deserves more attention, because it is very cool. So when seeing how easy it is to generate complexity, all this potential complexity in very simple systems, one question is, how many measures of complexity can you count? And there are many. I wouldn't know exactly what number, but the question would be, is the problem of understanding the world a problem of lacking metrics or methods? Or is it more about understanding the ones that we already have and understanding the landscape of complexity metrics and how they relate to each other? Because I think it is easier to basically come up with a new metric that really understands what the other metrics do or are. And we have a couple of papers in this topic, not as much as we would like. And one of the things as a community I think we should do is to understand the landscape of complexity metrics, is that most, if not all of them, are related to each other. And this is kind of an oversimplification, but we have 2 papers. One, for example, connecting, you see the paper at the bottom, fractal dimension with time complexity. And we have also a few papers exploring the connection between Shannon entropy with Kolmogorov complexity, which is not trivial. I'm not going to go into the details of this because it is not the purpose of the talk. But one way to characterize these complexity measures, and this is again oversimplifying, is that every one of these metrics is basically trying to characterize a feature of a pattern in the world. The underlying question behind, for example, classical probability, one way to put it is how likely an event or an object is. In Shannon entropy, one way to see it is how diverse an object is if you don't have access to the probability distribution. In Kolmogorov complexity, the traditional explanation for algorithmic complexity is that it characterizes how random an object or an event may be, and so on. So we think that all these metrics are basically capturing some fundamental property of the patterns that we see in the world, and that's kind of the hope. But I'm going to argue that actually not all patterns are equal, and we don't understand very well where to apply many of these complexity measures to what objects. Here are some examples of sequences. The first one is the simplest one, is basically just the alternation of zeros and ones. And I'm going to call it statistical because basically the sequence is giving away its simplistic origin nature. Basically just by looking at the sequence, if you're an observer looking one digit by digit come to you, modeled as a random variable, you immediately can make or come up with computable hypotheses behind that sequence and say, oh, it's likely coming from, for example, that kind of computer program. So in some way, the sequence is giving up some clues of its mechanistic origin. But turns out actually that the most interesting sequences, and many sequences, are of a different nature. I'm going to call them non-statistical because they don't give away so easily their mechanistic origin. And the second one, some of you may be familiar with, it is a two-more sequence, and you start with a 0, and you binary negate the first segment, so the next digit is 1, and then the new one is 0, 1, so you negate again, so 0, 1, 1, 0 will be the next step, and so on. I just described for you an infinite sequence, very short fashion. This sequence has been proven to be Borel normal, which in other words also means that it is maximal Shannon entropy rate. In other words, you don't have any overrepresentation of any subsequence compared to any other subsequence in the whole sequence. There's no statistical regularity, so any statistical metric that you apply on this sequence, if you don't know that is deterministic, because that's the whole point, you could ask, well, we already know that it is a two-more sequence. But as an observer, you don't. I'm modeling this as a random variable, and digits are coming to you. So it will be very hard to tell anything about this sequence if you don't know their mechanistic origin. We have here another sequence, which is the concatenation of the natural numbers. This is another number, a constant. It is called the chaperone constant, that is completely deterministic, but has also no statistical regularities. It's also Borel normal. It only makes sense to us because we have a convention of how we name natural numbers. But otherwise, there are no statistical regularities in this number. So again, I'm going to call this sequence non-statistical because it is not giving away its simplistic origin. And lastly, there's a slightly more complicated sequence because we don't have that convention. It is not the successor function. It is a segment of pi, which, as you may remember from the BBP formula, basically you can calculate any segment of pi without having to calculate the first digit. And for all purposes, it looks random. I think it hasn't been proven to be Borel normal. But if you plot the distribution of numbers, and it doesn't matter the subsequences, there's no statistical regularities in this sequence either. So what all these sequences have in common is that they come from a mechanistic causal origin, but some of them are more easy to find out than others. And actually, we have a nice paper that shows that human minds exploit these non-statistical regularities. And one way to see it is, for example, when you learn a telephone number, if that number doesn't have any regularity other than, for example, it is just the odd or even numbers in order, you don't have to remember the whole telephone number. You only remember that it's the first segment of prime numbers or whatever it is. So it is not statistical, it's really algorithmic. And I think this illustrates also this tension in science. There are two kinds of schools, one that uses a lot of statistical models, and this is one of my favorite examples from textbooks. This is a distribution of times between cars on a road, and they turn out to distribute in a Poisson distribution with this parameter, which basically means that cars come in batches. And it almost looks like magic when you see it the first time, because the statistical description is not giving you the cause. It's just telling you how the times between cars distribute. And you would think at the beginning, perhaps, that everybody's kind of agreeing at what time to hit the road, but obviously that doesn't work. To some extent, that's true because we kind of have the similar working hours, but it doesn't explain that all cars come like in these batches. And the explanation is very simple. There are always like slow drivers holding back faster ones, and that's why this phenomenon emerges. And actually, you can destroy the pattern just by adding new lanes. So you can make interventions, and then you destroy the pattern, and you can reconstruct it by adding lanes and then adding cars. And then you have slow drivers also holding back other behind. But you can see that the whole interpretation and the cost that I just given you comes from me. It didn't come from the metric or from the distribution. I made the whole interpretation afterwards. So that's what I call post-hoc interpretability. On the other hand, we have model-driven science. So we have a model which basically is telling you state by state and corresponds to the observation, to the states of the observation, and you can tell whether it corresponds or not and update it. And it doesn't matter that the model is wrong. It is already giving you an idea of what may be the mechanistic cause. And mechanistic means exactly that you can follow the process step by step. Here, there's nothing to follow. It is a descriptive thing, right? So one of the first things that we did, for example, was to try to explore how statistical metrics, in particular Shannon entropy, may be objective or subjective, or dependent on you describe things. And we came up with this very nice example of a graph that we created on our own. The graph is constructed in the following way. You start with node 1, with label 1, and then you keep adding nodes so that the number of edges corresponds to the number of edges that each node has. So if you look at, for example, step 2, node number 1 has 1 edge. Node number 2 has 2 edges. And node number 3 doesn't have 3 edges yet, and that's why it is in blue color. But in the next step, basically, you complete it. And you keep completing this number of edges so that they coincide. And this was completely on purpose because the degree sequence, which is a way to describe this graph and allows you to reconstruct the same graph, looks like maximal entropy on purpose because this is, again, the chaperone constant, which is Borel normal. It is maximal Shannon entropy rate. And it's a completely legitimate way to describe this graph. The other way to describe it is with the adjacency matrix, and you have the two descriptions on that side. And the adjacency matrix basically looks like all the diagonal with the ones. So obviously, it's low Shannon entropy. So you have two ways in which you can describe exactly the same deterministic graph that has divergent Shannon entropy values. And again, you could say, but this doesn't make sense. What is the Shannon entropy of something deterministic? Is 0. We already know it, right? But if you knew it, it doesn't make sense to apply Shannon entropy in the first place. What we do is to apply these tools when we don't know anything about the object. We don't have access to the probability distribution. We are an observer seeing an object unfolding over time. And if you are seeing this object unfolding over time and you represent it in two different ways, you get two completely different Shannon entropy values. So what we have is this situation in which you have the observer and a metric. Could be either the examples with the times between the cars, or could be the graph that I showed you before, where basically the burden or the weight of the interpretation is on the observer side and not the metric. The metric is not really very useful because it is highly observer or description dependent. And ideally, we should have like a more balanced situation. I mean, in the ideal world, the metric should be doing all of it and finding the models. But if we don't have that ideal case, at least there should be some balance where you are looking at some process unfolding, and basically you can have access to the generative mechanism. And this is what usually happens with an observer, that it can be misled. So either, this is again another elementary cellular automaton just for illustration purposes, and if you're an observer, you could be looking at different places of this system unfolding, and you could be misled into thinking that it is completely random, for example, if you are looking at the right, or that it is not random, it is very simple if you are looking at the left. And an ideal observer should have access to the source code. So this is very much along the lines of the theme of the conference, because we are trying to decipher this system that we are seeing as an experimenter or observer. And what I've been proposing for the last 10, 15 years, if not more, is that Kolmogorov complexity usually is seen as a measure of randomness, but it's actually a method of causality, a theory of causality. And that's because the theory helps you basically filter out the random cases. And then you are left with causality and triviality. And with statistical metrics, you can also identify triviality. So what you are left with is basically the middle. And this is because Kolmogorov complexity is suggesting that you have to find the computable model that explains something. If you don't find it, that's when something is random. But basically, the metric itself is telling you the purpose of trying to find that computable object. And I'm going to describe it here. So this is, for those not familiar with Kolmogorov complexity, this is the official definition. So the Kolmogorov complexity of an object S is basically the shortest computer program P that running on a universal constructor basically gives you back the original object, in this case S. And notice, for example, the first thing is that you need a universal constructor, but it doesn't have to be a universal Turing machine. It can be any universal system. There doesn't have to be a head or a tape. That basically you discount it. This metric is uncomputable, as Martin was saying, because you are requiring the system to find actually the shortest computer program. But as soon as you relax the condition of not finding minimality, the metric becomes computable because you can always keep computing to find a shorter model. So for the founders of the theory, it was very useful to have this requirement of minimality to prove all sort of mathematical theorems. But in practice, it's not really very practical, but I think embodies what we do in science. In science, we have an observation. We want to come up with a mechanistic model or computable model, which I'm using as synonyms because I think they are. It doesn't have to be the smallest one. So what we do in science is actually to try to find perhaps the smallest one, but we don't require to only find the smallest one. We always keep looking for another one. Smallest also in terms of how much you can explain with your model or your theory. And the diagram on the right is only to show that this definition is not only relevant to computer programs and binary strings. So the space of computer programs basically includes all the mathematical functions that you can think of, including ordinary differential equations, partial differential equations, recursive functions, and so on. So even in the example I put before, for example, in this one, this is obviously included in the space of computer programs. That doesn't mean that it has to halt or not. That's another question. And this should be even more obvious because basically 100% of what we do in science goes through a digital computer. So it is all numerical solutions to these kind of equations. And if you use the argument that Kolmogorov complexity cannot be applied because it is uncomputable, we wouldn't be doing basically all modern mathematics. Today, there are very few things that are actually decidable and computable. And those include propositional logic, Euclidean geometry, Pressburger arithmetic, Cartesian geometry. Above that, anything else is actually not computable, and that doesn't mean that we don't use it or we discard it or we don't approximate or deal with these theories. And actually, it's very easy to see how something can be not computable in mathematics. I think it has been proven that this set of equations is the smallest one describing the Lorentz attractor. But in general, if you ask these questions in mathematics, that is immediately uncomputable. What is the minimum set of differential equations describing a dynamical system? So it is very easy and quickly to find uncomputability and undecidability in modern mathematics. And that doesn't mean much. Imagine that we would say, starting a paper saying I'm not going to use calculus or theory of analysis or measure theory. In my opinion, that we have observation the stars and planets and unfolding. And basically, move them to the mechanistic model side of things, try to explain things. So before we had an explanation, we thought it could be divine intervention, and actually the planets have names of gods, or it could be magic. But basically, science has been moving all these processes towards the other side. And I think this illustrates very much the spirit of Kolmogorov complexity, of trying to move things that appear to be random, but actually keep finding computable models shorter than the thing that you want to describe, and move them to the other side. And Kolmogorov complexity has motivated or inspired a lot of research in the last 20, 25 years. One of the most perhaps landmark papers is this one from Lee, Cilibrasi and Vitani. Actually, it's not Lee in that paper, so it is only Cilibrasi and Vitani, showing that with the statistical compression algorithms, you can basically reconstruct, for example, a phylogenetic tree that corresponds to what we know in evolutionary theory, just by compressing mitochondrial DNA sequences. So that's kind of surprising, but actually we are also kind of critical of using popular statistical lossless compression algorithms, because they are more related to Shannon entropy to really Kolmogorov complexity. The only thing that makes them related to Kolmogorov complexity is by way of Shannon entropy, and they are not adding much more when you use popular statistical compression algorithms like LCW or GZIP and so on. Ourselves, we apply this, for example, to things like organic versus non-organic molecules. In this paper, I think in 2018, and we were able to show that we could separate these two groups quite well with a threshold between. I think we did it on over 50,000 molecular compounds or something like that. We did it both with compression, but also our own method that combines compression with something else that I'm going to explain. We thought this was worth reporting, but we never thought that this would be like more than that, or explain evolution or selection or anything like that, because there has been some suggestions that separating these groups, what we believe are compression algorithms, give you an insight into selection or evolution theory. But we've been applying all this in many applications, including a problem that is called nucleosome positioning, which is the second most important problem in molecular biology after protein folding. It's about finding these nucleosomes. These are like packages of DNA that give you an idea of what genes encode. And we always compare our metrics with the best gold standard in that field. So in this case, for example, I think it's the Kaplan model with which they were using nucleosome positioning. So when we use a new metric, we compare to the metric that was used before. So the question is, obviously, we can do better than statistics or lossless compression like LZW. Unfortunately, we can. It is very expensive, but I'm going to tell you how we have partially solved this problem of resources. And the alternative is called algorithmic probability, that was introduced by Ray Solomonoff. And you see a picture of him in this famous Dartmouth College workshop on AI, where basically the AI term was used for the first time. And basically, there's an agreement that artificial intelligence could be traced back to this particular moment. And Ray is together with other people like Marvin Minsky, McCarthy, and even Shannon. So this was a very important meeting. And it has been acknowledged that basically Ray Solomonoff gave a solution for artificial intelligence and optimal inference. And I'm going to rely on what Marvin Minsky actually said about it, so you don't have to trust me. But let me explain you very briefly how beautiful this theory is. So you may remember this idea of the infinite monkey theorem that was introduced by Emile Borel. The idea is that you have a monkey typing on a typewriter randomly. So basically, the monkeys are a source of randomness. You don't really need a monkey. But the experiment is to ask questions like how long it takes to write the works of Shakespeare using a source of randomness. And if you actually do the math, it turns out that just getting the first paragraph of Hamlet, for example, would take longer than the age of the universe. But the interesting thing happens when you replace the typewriter by a laptop. So now every keystroke, instead of being a letter of Hamlet, is a piece of computer program. And this works very nicely with this other object. So this is a mathematical constant pi. Let's ask how long it would take the monkey to get the first 200 digits of pi right. It will be 1 over 10, which is the base of pi, to the 200, right? So it's exponentially more difficult the more digits you want the monkey to get right. And this is an infinite number. But when you replace the typewriter with a laptop, now the monkey has to write a computer program that produces pi, not pi itself. And pi, because it's very short, it has a very short description or short formula, actually many. So that's because it is low Kolmogorov complexity. Then it has a very high probability to be produced by a random computer program. So you see how things change dramatically when you change something so easily. And this is a beautiful theory because I just connected complexity theory to probability, and that's why it is called algorithmic probability. And that's the relationship between probability and complexity is given by that coding theorem. And don't take my word for it. This is what Marvin Minsky said about algorithmic probability a few years before dying. It seems to me that the most important discovery since Gödel was the discovery by Chaitin, Solomonov, and Kolmogorov of the concept called algorithmic probability, which is a fundamental new theory. I wouldn't call it new theory, but maybe for him it was, of how to make predictions given a collection of experiences. Everybody should learn all about that and spend the rest of their lives working on it. So basically he was describing my life because I've been devoted to this for the last 15, 20 years. And it looked almost like he was regretting not to spend his own life in this. He had an amazing life, and he's one of my heroes, especially his book on, how is it called? Infinite Computation or something like that. It is a green book. But he gave this quotation basically a couple of years before passing away a few years ago. So what we came up with is this method and formula. It is a greedy algorithm because basically decomposes a larger problem into smaller pieces. And we call it the coding theorem method because it uses this relationship between Kolmogorov complexity and probability. And then block decomposition method because we are doing exactly what that illustration is showing, which is once you have like a large object, you decompose it into smaller pieces. Because the idea is to find a computable model for the large piece, but it is so large that the space of all possible computable hypotheses is very large. So you decompose it, and basically you try to explain each of those pieces separately, and then you put everything together. And basically the concatenation of the computer programs give you an idea of how you can construct the original larger object. Obviously, it may look like we are doing something quite arbitrary because maybe we find only like one program, but it is not the case. So actually what we do is to find a lot of computer programs. But before getting there, let me describe a little bit this formula because it has a very interesting component. The worst case scenario for this formula to behave is just like Shannon entropy because of the component at the end. It is the log of n. So basically it's counting repetitions, assuming a uniform distribution because you don't have access to the probability distribution. Is basically here the assumption. And another way to see this formula is that it is a weighted version of Shannon entropy because the CTM part, which is basically looking for computer programs that can explain pieces of the original object, is giving you some clue of how the probability distribution may look like, whether it is dealing with something deterministic or not. So in the best case, you don't have to run the Shannon entropy part. You find exactly the program that produces the original object. But in the worst case, if you didn't find any computer program, basically you are just applying Shannon entropy. So for us, it was very interesting to see how we could combine like the two of the best worlds, because we have the statistical component that we don't completely discard, but we also have the causal component that if we are lucky, basically we can say something about it. Another way to see it is this kind of iterative process. It is not exactly like evolutionary programming, but that's one way to see it. It is more like a Levin search, if you are familiar with it. And this concept of dovetailing, basically you start running all computer programs at the same time. And when you don't have enough resources, basically you go in cycles, running every program one step at a time, from smaller to larger, So obviously it is not only very expensive, but it is also very uncomputable, especially if you request to find the shortest computer program. But as I said before, that is not our purpose here. It's just to get a clue of the causal content of an object. So because we decompose the original object into small pieces, then we can find computable hypotheses for those small pieces. But actually, we also help the Levin search by doing something else. We do perturbation analysis. So we change a little bit the original object to see how the computable hypotheses that we have found on the other side actually change over time. So I'm going to show you some examples. And what the algorithm comes back with is basically what you are seeing on the right, which is completely transparent method that can give you even the state space diagram, the automaton behind the data. And here is the example of, for example, concatenating all the natural numbers, which is a Champ-own constant, which has no regularities, and how the process actually found the computer program that is able to explain the natural numbers. So this is an illustration of how this works, because basically we have like a sliding window looking into an object and trying to find some what we call the causal patches. And in practice, basically, we traverse the whole object. We don't only focus in a few places. And there's a whole paper even looking at what happens with the boundary conditions and many other things, comparing with other metrics. And all this works basically because we have this nice theorem on your right, which basically is telling you that if something is causal, most of their parts have to be causal as well. And the other way around, if you have something random, its parts cannot be causal or non-random. So there's a correspondence. And notice that I'm talking about the level of description, because I've got already some questions about, for example, what happens with thermodynamics, where perhaps the molecules are very complex, but the overall behavior, the emergent behavior is very simple. That could be the case, actually, but here I'm fixing the level of description, so you can see the comment there. Fix the level of description. This is actually what happens. And we can run this and already pinpoint, for example, some cases in which Shannon entropy would tell you that something is random, but actually it is not. Here is a very small example with two strings that look like high Shannon entropy, but actually have a very small computer program that can be produced. And this also is very popular in textbooks of Shannon entropy and information theory. If you plot all the values of Shannon entropy applied to a set of binary strings, they distribute into a Bernoulli distribution like that. And if you apply lossless compression algorithms like LCW or GZIP, you get exactly the same distribution. So they coincide, and that basically tells you that they are doing exactly the same thing. They are not more related to Kolmogorov complexity than what Shannon entropy was already related to. But then our distribution actually starts looking different, and it is normalized to the top and bottom, obviously. And it starts building a long-tail distribution which conforms with the expected distribution, which, by the way, is called the universal distribution, and it is a concept in algorithmic probability. There's a beautiful paper called The Miraculous Universal Distribution by Vitali, published 15 or 20 years ago, also talking about algorithmic probability. So another common misconception that algorithmic probability can give you some clue about, this idea that Turing machines, digital computers, or even algorithmic complexity can't deal with uncertainty. That is very common, because our idea of a Turing machine is something that is a very deterministic step-by-step. And this is the core of algorithmic probability. You can write a universal Turing machine that basically is some sort of belief updater. Because what you have is that you have found a computable hypothesis, a computer program that can explain an unfolding process, like these sequences on the screen. And when there's new evidence, a new observation, and it doesn't coincide with the output of that computer program, basically you go to the next computer program that best describes the new sequence. And actually, you can assign a confidence value to the computer program explaining the sequence, because algorithmic probability is telling you that if you have more computer programs explaining a single sequence, like the digits of pi, it is of lower algorithmic probability. So you have this concept of actually having more or less computer programs explaining an object and then assigning a confidence value. And then actually, your computable hypotheses are also sorted by size, which somehow captures this idea of Occam's razor. So you favor the simplest theory. In this case, the simplest is the shortest. But you can easily see how you can implement like a Bayesian estimator. And actually Solomonov and Levin showed that algorithmic probability is the ultimate Bayesian predictor. It's the optimal theory of inference. Actually, it is more like abduction, because what you have access to is partial information. So it is the optimal theory of abduction. And with our own approach, for example, we can find that the same computer program is able to explain many of the subsequences of a sequence like pi. And we have done a lot of experiments showing that actually we pick up signals that indicate that some of these objects are causal rather than just statistical. So now it is the concept of algorithmic information dynamics, which is this idea of introducing perturbation analysis into the mix. And you can see how interesting this is, because we already combined Shannon entropy with Kolmorov complexity, and now we are introducing another concept that is also fundamental in the theory of causality today, and was introduced by some people at places like Carnegie Mellon, but also Judea Pearl with the do calculus. So this idea of perturbing a system to try to find out and reveal causal mechanisms. And here we have some examples. So let's say we have, like, for example, the sequence of all ones, and you can either perturb the object randomly or not. Let's say that the perturbation actually is a flip of a digit into 0. So the original explanation for that sequence was very simple, because the sequence was very simple, it had a very short computer program. But when you do a perturbation like this one, then the computable hypothesis changes the length. And remember also that I'm not talking only about one computer program. We find like hundreds or even thousands of computer programs explaining the same object. So you can take the average of the length of your computable hypothesis. And the other example is you start from a random object, and then you do a random perturbation. Then your computable hypothesis doesn't change much, because that was already long to describe. And when you introduce a random perturbation into a random object, basically the computable hypothesis remains pretty much the same in terms of length. And everything else basically lies in the middle. But you can see how interesting this is, because the nature of how things change in software space is telling you two things: the nature of the original object and also the nature of your perturbation. So the way I like to see this is almost like the Matrix, for those familiar with the movie, because we are basically trying to relate the real world, which, I mean, it looks like sequences, but it could be anything, with the software space or the algorithmic world. We are trying to explain everything with computable hypotheses and what happens on this side when something happens on the other side. So it's almost like seeing these green screens in the Matrix to try to find out things about the other side. And you can, as I said, you can do this with anything. It doesn't have to be binary sequences or sequences at all. You can do it with networks. And if you can do it with networks, because there are adjacency matrices, you can do it with images, or you can also do it with vectors, tensors, and pretty much anything that has a computable description, you can apply these ideas. So here are three examples, two on the extreme of the complex networks spectrum, where you can describe a graph or network that is very simple with a very short computer program. So for example, the complete graph is basically connect everything to everything else. I just gave you the description, and it doesn't matter the size of the complete graph. The description almost remains unchanged. You only have to change the number of nodes. That grows the description by the logarithm of the number of nodes. But if you have a random graph, especially an algorithmic random one, then you cannot take advantage of any regularity, and every time that you grow the network, you have to describe exactly where the edge is going to go. So the growth of the algorithmic complexity of a random graph basically grows by the number of edges. And everything else is like in the middle, no? complex networks. And then you can start playing in the same way. What happens when we remove a node or an edge to the set of computable hypotheses? Do they grow? Do they shrink? What happens? When you remove an element that makes your computer programs go smaller, we call it a positive element, because basically it had like a shift towards a shorter computer program. And when you remove or perturb an element, it produces a longer average of computer programs, we call it a negative one. So we started applying all this. It didn't remain in the theoretical realm only. So for the last 10, 15 years, I've been associated to positions in different places where we apply all these ideas. And this is a very famous network. It is called a transcription factor network, and it is from a bacteria, E. coli. And this is validated because they have basically done in the lab knockout experiments where they silence every one of the genes and basically see how they connect to other genes. So this has been already validated experimentally. So we colored all the nodes according to the definition I gave you in the last slide. Whether removing that node, if you look at the computable hypothesis space, whether that is increasing the size of your computer programs or reducing their size. And then we go to are called genome browsers. If you're not familiar with genome browsers, basically these are online repositories where you provide the clusters of genes, and basically what you get back is whether those clustering makes any biological functional sense, if you are clustering by anything interesting. So it is a very nice way to validate whether this kind of clustering is doing anything or not. If you are not doing anything interesting, basically the result is flat. No clusters come back. In this case, we got these clusters to our own surprise, but it is not completely a surprise because this network is already showing, the topology of the network is actually underlying functionality behind this biological entity. So we used 3 different genome browsers, and the 3 of them came back with these 6 clusters, basically showing that by clustering these nodes that are genes, we are actually clustering in some functional way, which was very interesting. So we kept exploring, obviously. So we took a few more networks. This one is an immune cell called TH17, which it is not completely differentiated. So it is not a completely stem cell, but it is in the middle of the process. It is a stem cell for the process of immune cells. And there are 3 time steps towards completely maturing the cell. And then we apply the same idea because we have a genetic network for this system over time. So we have 3 steps. That's why there are 3 plots. And on the other side, there are also 3 columns. So at the beginning, when you do our analysis, the perturbation analysis with algorithmic information dynamics, what you get is about half of the genes can move the network towards randomness, and the other half can move it towards simplicity. So in some way, it's like highly programmable because you can move it both ways. Then in the second step, basically the genes flipped all over. So now you have actually half of them that were positive before, almost negative, no? Kind of. It is noisy. But then we had the third step where it is a completely mature cell, and basically it was kind of locked in, even in algorithmic space, meaning that there's no change that you can make to the network, removing any node, that would make the computable hypothesis grow on average. And again, that was an interesting result, so we applied it to many more networks, genetic networks underlying a lot of type of cells that you are seeing on the right. And then we were able to reconstruct a Waddington energy landscape with this idea of reprogrammability. So how many genes can send your system towards one side or the other? And that was, again, very interesting. And obviously, I'm going very fast through all of this, but you can see the pointers to the papers like iScience. So in some way, we have this very interesting connection between the algorithmic space and the dynamical system space. And we did all sorts of experiments, even with Boolean networks, for example, how many attractors will be on average when we remove some nodes or the others, or reachable states, for example. And in all cases, we found some statistical significance that we were actually picking up some interesting signals. If you are interested in these ideas, there's a very nice video produced by Nature out of a paper that we published a few years ago, and you can scan the QR code. We didn't pay for this video. They were just, I guess, excited about our paper, and they produced it. We published this in Nature Machine Intelligence 6 years ago. But let me summarize very quickly some of the common misconceptions that if I didn't convince you otherwise, at least you now have an alternative view of them. So misconception number 1, Kolmorph complexity cannot be applied because it is uncomputable. Most areas of modern mathematics are incomplete, undecidable, and uncomputable. Kolmorph complexity requires a universal Turing machine, and account perhaps even for the Turing universal Turing machine, and perhaps the humans that have to build the digital computers. I've heard that argument before. For me, it doesn't make sense, but it is a common misconception that things don't make sense because you need digital computers to apply Kolmogorov complexity to make any sense. Okay, I've seen that before. Kolmogorov complexity only measures randomness. I mean, it is a mathematical metric of randomness, accepted mathematical theory. But it is not only that. I already gave you my own view that I think it is a theory of causality. Turing machines are niche and can't deal with uncertainty. It is false. Algorithmic probability is exactly the opposite of that. Kolmogorov complexity can be approximated by statistical means like Lempev-Ziv and popular lossless compression algorithms. That is also mostly false. I mean, it is true only because it is connected to Shannon entropy, and Shannon entropy is loosely connected to Kolmogorov complexity in some way. Something that is low Shannon entropy is also low Kolmogorov complexity, but not the other way around. Turing machines can't deal with real data. It is also false, and that should be almost obvious in science today because basically we use digital computers for literally everything. So I'm going to stop there, and before that I have a couple of books if you're more interested in these topics. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Hector, for this great talk. We have time for some questions, and I see already Hiroki has a question.
Yeah. Thank you so much for a super nice talk. Very interesting. I have a bunch of questions, but I would choose just one. So uncomputability or undecidability can be seen as kind of challenge that the science or learning mechanism need to cope with. Or the other way to see the same thing is that maybe that's the reason why science exists, or learning. So can you comment on that kind of alternative view? That's the source,
yeah,
right? Yeah,
absolutely. So for me, uncomputability is almost this idea of open-endedness. Yeah. Because in science, if we were able, for example, to find this minimalistic model, we wouldn't have anything else to do. So it's this idea of actually having something that you have to keep computing over time, and it is a never-ending process. So I agree that for me, uncomputability is actually what you require to deal with the complexity and open-endedness of the world.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. So it is a feature, not a bug, in my opinion.
Asa?
Thank you for the wonderful talk. Just a weird question. So in training neural network, there is a phenomenon called grokking. And when you train the network like long enough, then suddenly even reach the bottom of the loss, then loss just dropped. And suddenly, yeah. So it's called grokking. So I'm wondering if this is related to like the network can finding the good program. And if it's related, then what happened in the training of a neural network that can make this happen?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the concept, but definitely we have done some work on trying to apply these ideas to AI and neural networks with some success. And you may have heard people like Elon Musk and also Ilya, I don't remember his last name, from OpenAI, basically saying that all this is very much connected to Kolmogorov complexity and compression. But yeah, I think there's a lot of potential in neural networks. Our main challenge is that we are dealing with a discrete theory, and for things like gradient descent and those kind of things that require differentiability is kind of a challenge, but we have been able to combine them in interesting ways. So I think there's a lot of application there, and we already have a few papers about it. Mm-hmm. By the way, something else I should mention is that at the core of neural networks, there's these loss functions that are always based in Shannon entropy. So that's also another thing to consider. So that neural networks are basically statistical tools that may give the impression to deal with causality, and maybe in some way they do, as long as you have like these statistical regularities. But for more complex things, they definitely fall down into the same correlation trap. Okay.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. I have a question about, do you think that there are some links between the steps that you use to compute your measure and the steps that are necessary to build epsilon machines?
Yeah, interesting question about epsilon machines. So in some way I like epsilon machines, but I don't like the terms that have been used to define them because I don't even think they are really machines, or they are really related to software space or algorithms, so in some way they are very misleading. So if they hadn't used that narrative, I would perhaps taken in a much more positive view the whole theory. But I think it is still interesting. I think it lives still in mostly the statistical world, and they can be like improved perhaps by combining some of these ideas. But some interesting work has been done there.
Okay, yeah, you can.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful. My question relates to computational complexity, like complexity classes, because you can have a problem and then solve it in one way, which might take, I mean, I don't think of the size of the program, but how long it takes, right? So some algorithms take a lot of time, some others take shorter time. And I wonder if what you have done relates to this, because you can find I've always been thinking about what is the stupidest way to sort a list of numbers, you know, because the fastest way is kind of n log n-ish form. But now I think that the most stupid algorithm will be like just a flip monkey sorting, you know. And now that I see there is a boundary on the most stupid way without being redundant, trivial but not redundant. So I'm looking if you have been thinking about that.
Yeah, one of the first papers I showed deals with those connections, the one that relates fractal dimension to time complexity. So it is a fascinating topic for research, and it is very much open how it relates to each other. We found some interesting things to say about the connection between time complexity and algorithm complexity, which is related to fractal dimension. So you can see why it is so interesting, this paper, because it's already connecting several complexity measures. But when it comes to time complexity, is very interesting because unlike Kolmogorov complexity, that doesn't really depend on the size of the universal Turing machine or the architecture, time complexity fully relies on the architecture of the Turing machine. As soon as you change the underlying definition, for example, use a cellular automaton, which is highly parallel, then some of your complexity classes collapse. So unlike other areas, time complexity is very much dependable on the architecture of the Turing machine. And actually, we already know some examples, like in real life, doesn't work that way. So if you want to sort, for example, this is my favorite example I came up with, hopefully makes sense. So if you have like straws and you want to sort them by size, like plastic straws that you use for drinks, basically the thing that you can do in real life is just to hit it against the table. And basically in constant time, no matter how many straws, you have them sorted. So we already know that in physical terms, time complexity may not fully correspond to what actually happens in the natural world. But that's completely different to Kolmogorov complexity. You cannot really use that sort of arguments against Kolmogorov complexity because there are none, for two reasons. For time complexity, you don't require Turing universality. For Kolmogorov, you do. And then you may think, but what happens if I change the underlying universal Turing machine? We have this invariance theorem in Kolmogorov complexity that is very powerful and basically tells you that changing the underlying computational model is bounded by a small constant and basically converges, which is something we don't have in Shannon entropy or many other areas.
One last question, hopefully not too long.
I promise I'll be quick. The E. coli experiment is super fascinating. I was just wondering, a very silly technical question, how long did it actually take to run and compute that?
Oh, okay, so how long it takes to run these methods? Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So what we are doing is basically to store partial solutions to many of these objects. So we exchange computational resources for memory, basically. So once you have seen something before, we store it. We have a Gödel number, basically explaining that binary or non-binary string. and we don't have to recompute it again. And if we want to explore the computer program, basically we go to the Gödel number and basically unpack it. So for things that you haven't seen before, it's very expensive, and ultimately is, as I said, uncomputable, but not as uncomputable as requiring the minimal program, because we are relaxing that condition. But you can make very much educated guesses and accelerate things. But it's one of the main challenges. If this were cheap, we would be basically solving science. So that's exactly what we cannot do, and we have to combine it with statistics. Mm-hmm.
Okay, then let's thank Hector one more time, and then that's it.
Perfect. Awesome.